We've spent the past couple of slides talking about protein folding. I want to show you an example of how protein folding can cause disease. I'm sure that many of you have heard of the disease sickle cell disease. It's a disease affecting red blood cells. This is a photograph taken of different red blood cells. So this red blood cell right here is kind of your standard everyday normal red blood cell. It's sort of circular shaped. It has a small indentation in the middle. People who have sickle cell disease very often make red blood cells that have this elongated shape, that kind of with a pointy end. That's sort of common of people who have sickle cell disease. They may also make sort of the more traditional type of red blood cell, but they make these types of red blood cells which can cause problems. These red blood cells tend to be somewhat rigid. Because of their shape, because the shape is a lot longer, they sometimes get stuck in capillaries. They can cause a lot of pain. They can cause destruction of tissues. And people who have this disease, it's a pretty horrible disease. They often live substantially less than the standard life expectancy. They can have difficulty breathing, as I said, tissue necrosis, a lot of pain. Sickle cell disease is very often caused by a change in the order of the amino acids in hemoglobin. Now, we talked about hemoglobin in a previous section. We said that hemoglobin is a protein molecule that is, its job is basically to pick up oxygen from the lungs and transport it to other tissues in the cell. Hemoglobin is found in red blood cells. So as your red blood cells are moving through your body, they are carrying around hemoglobin protein molecules. Those red blood cells might end up in your lungs. When they're in your lungs, the hemoglobin that's inside of them will pick up oxygen, and basically those red blood cells will move out of your lungs to other tissues, and the hemoglobin will then release the oxygen to other tissues in the body that need oxygen. So I want you to think of these red blood cells as having many, many hemoglobin protein molecules sort of bouncing around inside of them. This is the one-letter abbreviation of some of the amino acids that are found in the hemoglobin protein molecule. There's leucine, there's threonine, proline, and this particular E that's highlighted in blue, this is called glutamic acid, and you sort of continue on. The protein is relatively large protein molecule. It has many more amino acids than this, but this is the relevant part for the disease. People who have this particular amino acid, glutamic acid, at this position, sandwiched in between a proline and another glutamic acid, they are healthy. The people who have sickle cell disease don't have this glutamic acid amino acid in this position. They have a different amino acid. They make hemoglobin that has, instead of glutamic acid, they have a V here, and V is the abbreviation for valine. So you might say, well, what's the big deal? Why does that cause a disease? If you look on one of the previous slides or one of the PowerPoint slides, you will see that glutamic acid is a hydrophilic amino acid, and valine is a relatively hydrophobic amino acid. And it turns out that because this is a hydrophilic amino acid, people who are healthy, who have the glutamic acid here, they make a hemoglobin, and this glutamic acid, because it's hydrophilic, is found on the surface of the hemoglobin molecule. So here it is. Here's my little glutamic acid sitting on the surface of my cartoon representation of the three-dimensional hemoglobin molecule. And it's perfectly happy there. It's exposed to water. There's water surrounding this entire protein, but because glutamic acid is hydrophilic, it has a reasonably good time interacting with the water. Valine is hydrophobic. So all of a sudden, people who have sickle cell disease, they are making hemoglobin molecules that are shoving a hydrophobic amino acid out onto the surface of the protein molecule. And this hydrophobic amino acid does not like to interact with water. What ends up happening, though, is that there are many of these, right? Each red blood cell has many hemoglobin molecules. And if there are many of these running around inside of that red blood cell, what they do is they clump together. They clump together because they're trying to bury their valines away from the water that's surrounding them. And if they clump together, they don't stay dissolved as easily in the liquid in the red blood cells. They clump together and they cause these these red blood cells to form these weird shapes because they're basically not folding properly. They're clumping together like this. And when they clump together, they cause these red blood cells to assume these weird shapes. The red blood cells get stuck in capillaries. They cause difficulty breathing and all of these other symptoms that you see with sickle cell disease. So it's this tiny little change of a hydrophilic amino acid to a hydrophobic one that essentially causes this horrible disease, that causes these hemoglobin molecules to clump together, force the shape of the red blood cell out of its normal shape, and then causing these terrible symptoms and eventually shortened lifespan. So this is an example of proteins folding up in 3 dimensions, or clumping up in 3 dimensions in this case, that can cause a disease. I want you to realize that this is a tiny bit of an oversimplification. Hemoglobin is a little bit more complicated than I'm showing you here, but the basics of the disease are exactly what I described to you. It's almost always caused by a change of a hydrophilic amino acid here into a hydrophobic one here. So that's sickle cell disease, and that's an example of where protein folding can have an effect on human health.